The chamber fell silent as Ambassador Vexitar's four arms gestured toward the holographic display. Earth hung there like a blue marble, suspended in the vastness of space, its continents clearly visible through swirling clouds. Around the circular council hall, representatives from 47 different species watched with expressions ranging from relief to uncertainty. "The motion has been passed," Vexitar announced, his crystalline voice echoing through the vast chamber. "By a vote of 39-8, humanity is hereby expelled from the Galactic Confederation. All trade agreements are terminated. All diplomatic relations are severed. All human colonies beyond their home system must be evacuated within one standard cycle." Dr. Sarah Chen stood slowly from her seat in the designated human section, her hands trembling slightly as she activated her translation device. The small woman appeared insignificant among the towering alien forms surrounding her, but her voice carried clearly through the chamber when she spoke. "Esteemed council members," she began, "I understand your decision, though I disagree with it. My species has made mistakes. We have been too aggressive in our expansion, too quick to resort to violence when diplomacy might have sufficed. But before we leave, I must share something with you, something critical." The Zephyrian delegate, a being that resembled a cross between a mantis and a flower, clicked his mandibles impatiently. "Humanity has had 3 standard years to present any relevant information. The time for words has passed." Sarah's dark eyes swept across the assembly, meeting the gaze of beings whose ancestors had achieved space flight while humans were still discovering fire. "You are making a mistake that will cost millions of lives. In our exploration of the Outer Rim territories, we discovered something that you have refused to acknowledge despite our repeated warnings." The supposed ancient threat from beyond the galactic barrier? The Throkian representative's tentacles writhed in what their species considered laughter. "More human paranoia and warmongering. You seek to maintain your position by manufacturing phantom enemies." Sarah pulled up her own holographic display, showing star charts marked with strange energy signatures and disturbing astronomical data. "These are not phantoms. The readings are consistent across 17 different systems along the Outer Rim. Something is coming through the galactic barrier, something that has already consumed 3 solar systems in the Andromeda Gap." The Crystalline Collective's speaker, a being made entirely of living mineral, resonated with a sound like wind chimes. Even if such a threat existed, the barrier has held for 3 million years. The ancient warnings speak of safeguards that cannot be breached. "The safeguards are failing," Sarah insisted, her voice growing more urgent. "The energy signatures match theoretical models for multidimensional breach points. Whatever built the barrier did so to keep something out, and that something is testing the boundaries. We've tracked at least 12 probe incursions in the last 2 years." "Probe incursions that only humans claim to have detected," scoffed the Valerian delegate, its blue skin shifting through patterns of disdain. "How convenient that only the most violent species in known space can sense this supposed danger." Sarah felt frustration building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We're violent because we evolved in a dangerous galaxy. Our homeworld was harsh, our early history filled with conflict and struggle. That same background that you condemn us for is exactly what makes us capable of recognizing this threat. We know predators. We know what it looks like when something is hunting." The council chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien languages as representatives began arguing among themselves. Some spoke of human deception, others of the impossibility of threats from beyond the barrier. The few species that had shown sympathy for humanity looked uncertain, swayed by the majority opinion. Vexitar raised all 4 arms for silence. "The decision stands. Humanity's aggressive nature and constant warnings of external threats are precisely why this expulsion is necessary. The galaxy has known peace for 18,000 years under Confederation guidance. We will not allow one species to drag us into unnecessary conflicts based on unsubstantiated claims. Sarah activated a new display showing detailed technical readouts and sensor logs. These are substantiated. We have gravimetric anomalies, temporal distortions, and exotic matter signatures that match no known natural phenomena. Our deep space monitoring stations have recorded sounds. Sounds? The insectoid delegate's compound eyes focused on her with sudden interest. Transmissions. Signals that carry across subspace in patterns that suggest intelligence, not random cosmic noise, but deliberate communication. Something is coordinating movements beyond the barrier, and those movements are getting closer to breach points. The chamber fell quiet again as the implications sank in. For a moment, Sarah thought she might have reached them. Then the Zephyrian delegate spoke again. Even assuming these readings are accurate and not human fabrications, why should we trust the interpretation of a species that sees threats everywhere? Humans have initiated 17 military conflicts since joining the Confederation. Your response to every challenge is violence. Because sometimes violence is necessary, Sarah replied, her composure finally cracking. You've all lived in peace for so long that you've forgotten what danger looks like. You've grown soft behind your defenses, protected by the very barrier that's now failing. We're trying to warn you that something is coming. Something that won't be deterred by diplomatic immunity or trade agreements. The Throkian representative's tentacles coiled with what their species considered amusement. And naturally, humanity volunteers to be our protectors? How altruistic of the species that tried to claim territorial rights over 37 different systems. We don't want to be your protectors, Sarah shot back. We want to work together to prepare for what's coming. But you're so afraid of our potential for violence that you're blinding yourselves to the violence that's already heading our way. The vote has been cast, Vextar declared firmly. Humanity will be escorted from Confederation space within the specified time frame. These warnings will be recorded and investigated by appropriate Confederation science vessels when resources permit. Sarah knew it was over. She could see it in the way the delegates had already begun turning away, their attention moving to other matters. The holographic data floating before her represented years of careful observation, detailed analysis, and growing dread. None of it mattered to beings who had never faced true existential threat. "There's one more thing," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying to the front rows. "In our studies of the barrier systems, we discovered something about their construction. They weren't built by any current Confederation species. The technology is older, more sophisticated than anything in your archives, but there are human genetic markers in the construction algorithms. That got their attention." The chamber buzzed with sudden conversation as delegates leaned forward to hear more clearly. "Impossible," breathed the crystalline collective speaker. "Humanity has only existed as a spacefaring species for 300 years. The barriers are millions of years old." Sarah nodded grimly. "Exactly. Which means either humanity is far older than any of us realized, or something that created us was involved in building those barriers. Our genetic code contains sequences that match harmonic frequencies in the barrier technology. We're not just observers of what's coming. We're connected to it." "More human fantasy," the Zephyrian delegate declared, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Desperate attempts to claim relevance through mysterious connections to ancient technology." "Maybe," Sarah admitted. "But what if we're right? What if our warnings are accurate, and our connection to the barriers means we're the key to understanding how to repair them or strengthen them? Are you willing to bet the safety of the entire galaxy on the assumption that we're wrong?" The silence that followed was heavier than before. Several delegates exchanged glances with their neighbors, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into their expressions. But fear of humanity's violent nature seemed to outweigh their fear of unknown threats. "The decision stands," Vextar repeated, though his tone was less certain than before. "Humanity's expulsion will proceed as planned. If these threats prove real, the Confederation will address them through appropriate channels." Sarah gathered her data displays and deactivated her equipment. As she prepared to leave the chamber for the final time, she turned back to address the assembly one last time. "When it comes, and it will come, remember this moment. Remember that we tried to warn you, tried to work with you, tried to prepare together. When your peaceful worlds are burning and your citizens are screaming for help, remember that you chose to face this alone." She paused at the chamber's exit, looking back at the representatives who had sealed humanity's fate. "We'll be out there, beyond your borders, doing what we've always done, fighting, surviving, preparing for the worst while hoping for the better. When you're ready to admit you need us, you know where to find us." The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, and Ambassador Sarah Chen walked down the gleaming corridors of the Confederation headquarters for the last time. Behind her, the debate continued, but the outcome was already decided. Humanity would leave, taking their warnings and their weapons with them. 2 months later, the human evacuation was complete. 12 colonies abandoned, 3 major trade hubs transferred to Confederation control, and nearly 50 million humans relocated to ships bound for the outer rim territories beyond Confederation space. The exodus was remarkably peaceful, with only minor incidents of violence despite the bitterness many humans felt toward their former allies. Admiral Marcus Thompson stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the last human transport vessels clear Confederation space. The massive dreadnought had been humanity's contribution to Confederation defense, but now it served as the flagship for their exile fleet. "All ships report successful departure," his communications officer announced. "We're officially beyond the border markers." Thompson nodded grimly. Around him, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, but he could feel the tension in the air. 300 years of peaceful cooperation had ended in less than 4 months, from the first vote of no confidence to this moment of final separation. "Admiral," his science officer called out, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Deep Space Monitoring Station Alpha 7. They're reporting new anomalies at coordinates previously flagged by Dr. Chen. Put it on the main screen." The view screen filled with star charts showing the outer rim regions where humanity had established their most distant outposts. Red markers indicated areas of gravitational disturbance, and as Thompson watched, new markers appeared in real time. "The disturbances are increasing in frequency and intensity," the science officer reported. "Whatever's testing the barrier is getting bolder." Thompson's jaw tightened as he studied the data. The patterns were unmistakable to anyone with military training. Probing attacks, testing defenses, searching for weaknesses. Classic predator behavior from something that had found prey. "Send a final transmission to the Confederation Council," he ordered. "Full technical specifications on the anomalies, complete sensor logs, and our tactical assessment. Make sure they can't claim they weren't warned." "Sir?" His communications officer hesitated. "They've blocked all transmissions from human sources. The message won't get through their filters." "Then broadcast it on all frequencies. Send it to every independent colony, every merchant vessel, every research station within range. If the Confederation won't listen to warnings, maybe someone else will." As the UES Defiance led the human Exodus fleet deeper into the unknown regions beyond Confederation space, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving toward something rather than away from it. The star charts showed dozens of uninhabited systems where humanity could establish new colonies, but they also showed the areas where the barrier was thinnest, where something vast and hungry was pressing against the boundaries of their reality. 3 weeks into their journey, the first confirmed breach occurred. Deep Space Monitoring Station. Beta 9 went silent during a routine transmission, its automated distress beacon activating for exactly 17 seconds before cutting off entirely. When the nearest human patrol ship arrived to investigate, they found nothing but debris and strange energy residue that made their instruments scream warnings about dimensional instability. The pilot's final transmission was brief and terrifying. "There's something here, something that doesn't belong in our universe. It's beautiful and horrible, and it's looking at me, and oh God, it sees me. It sees everything we are, and it's hungry. It's so hungry, and..." Silence. Thompson received the report while the exile fleet was establishing its first new colony on a world they named Haven. The planet was harsh but habitable, with rich mineral deposits and defensible geography. It would serve as humanity's new capital, a place to rebuild their civilization beyond the reach of Confederation politics. But as he read the report from Beta 9, Thompson realized they hadn't moved beyond the reach of something far worse than political exile. They had moved closer to it. "Recall all deep space patrols," he ordered. "Set up defensive perimeters around our new colonies, and start production on every weapons platform we have blueprints for." "Sir?" his aide questioned. "We're supposed to be starting peaceful settlements." Thompson looked out at the alien sky of Haven, where 3 moons hung like watchful eyes in the twilight. "Peace is a luxury we can't afford anymore. The Confederation threw us out because they thought we were too violent, too dangerous. They're about to learn that sometimes being dangerous is the only thing that keeps you alive." On the surface below, human colonists worked to establish their new home, unaware that their exile had brought them face to face with something that would test every violent instinct their species possessed. The barriers were failing, the watchers beyond were stirring, and humanity stood alone on the edge of the abyss. But they had been alone before, on a dozen battlefields across a dozen worlds. They had survived ice ages and supervolcanic eruptions, plague and famine, and the countless disasters that had forged them into the most adaptable predators the galaxy had ever seen. The Confederation wanted peace and safety behind their ancient barriers. Humanity would give them war and survival beyond them. 6 months after humanity's exile, the first Confederation colony fell. The Zephyrian agricultural world of Bloom's End had been a symbol of peaceful cooperation for 2 centuries. Its floating cities harvested exotic crops that fed 17 different species. Its research stations studied ways to improve yield and nutrition across the galaxy. When the distress signal arrived at Confederation headquarters, it consisted of only 3 words before cutting to static: "The Gardens scream." Admiral Kethvar of the Confederation Defense Force received the emergency deployment orders while his fleet was conducting routine patrols near the Vegan trade routes. His ships were built for show more than warfare, designed to project peaceful authority rather than deliver devastating firepower. The elegant curves and gleaming hulls looked magnificent in formation, but their weapons systems hadn't been upgraded in 50 years. "Set course for the Bloom's End system," he ordered, his confidence unshaken despite the cryptic distress call. "Maximum speed. Whatever equipment malfunction or terrorist action has occurred, we'll restore order quickly." The journey took 4 days, during which additional fragments of transmissions reached them. Voices speaking in languages that registered on no known translation matrices. Sounds that made hardened communications officers physically ill. And underneath it all, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to bypass their instruments entirely and resonate in their bones. When Admiral Kethvar's fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Bloom's End system, they found a garden of horrors. The floating cities still hung in the upper atmosphere of the agricultural world, but they moved wrong. Instead of the gentle orbital patterns that maximized growing conditions, they swayed and danced like leaves in a cosmic wind. Their surfaces pulsed with colors that hurt to look at directly. and their crops had grown into twisted spirals that reached toward space like grasping fingers. "Scanning for survivors," his sensor operator reported, her voice tight with strain. "I'm getting readings, but they don't make sense. Life signs are present, but the patterns are completely alien. Nothing matches known Zephyrian biology." "Alien infiltrators?" Kethvar suggested, though he felt a chill running down his spine. Perhaps the rumors of external threats were more accurate than we believed. Before anyone could respond, the communications console erupted with sound. Not words or even recognizable language, but something that conveyed meaning directly into their minds. Images of vast, hungering presences that existed between dimensions. Promises of transformation and ecstasy, and the sweet dissolution of individual consciousness into something greater. 3 crew members collapsed at their stations, their minds overwhelmed by contact with intelligence that operated on frequencies biological brains weren't designed to process. The ship's medical bay filled with personnel suffering from what the doctors could only describe as existential shock. "Full retreat," Kethvar ordered, his usual composure cracking. "All ships, emergency jump to safe distance. Send priority transmission to Confederation Council. Whatever happened here is beyond our current capabilities." But as his fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace, something reached out from the corrupted cities below. Not a weapon or tractor beam, but a presence that wrapped around their ships like invisible tentacles. For a terrifying moment, Kethvar felt his consciousness touched by something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. Then his chief science officer triggered an experimental gravitational pulse that severed the connection, and the fleet escaped into hyperspace. Behind them, Bloom's End continued its impossible dance, its floating gardens singing songs that would give nightmares to anyone who heard them. The report that reached the Confederation Council 3 days later was classified at the highest levels and shared with only senior leadership. Even so, word spread quickly through the political networks that something catastrophic had occurred at Bloom's End. When pressed for details, officials spoke in vague terms about dimensional anomalies and external infiltration. Ambassador Vexitar, who had presided over humanity's expulsion, found himself facing a crisis unlike anything in his 2-century career. The evidence was undeniable now. The readings matched exactly what the humans had warned about, and the threat was clearly beyond anything the peaceful Confederation could handle. "We need to contact the human exile fleet," he announced to the emergency session of the Inner Council. "They warned us about this threat. They may know how to combat it." "Absolutely not," declared the Throkian representative. "Humanity's expulsion was justified by their violent nature. We cannot allow one crisis to undermine the principles of peaceful cooperation that have guided our civilization for millennia." "Our principles won't matter if this threat spreads," Vextar argued. "The tactical analysis suggests that whatever attacked Bloom's End was probing our defenses. There will be more attacks, each one larger and more coordinated than the last." The debate continued for hours, while emergency reports flooded in from across Confederation space. 2 more agricultural worlds had gone silent. Deep space monitoring stations were detecting massive energy buildups along the galactic barrier, and refugee ships fleeing the affected systems brought stories of impossible horrors and reality itself breaking down. Meanwhile, in the exile territories beyond Confederation space, humanity was preparing for war. Colonel Sarah Chen had traded her diplomat's robes for military fatigues, accepting command of the Deep Space Reconnaissance Division that monitored barrier stability. Her warnings to the Confederation had been ignored, but her own species took them seriously. Every human colony now bristled with defensive installations, and their industrial capacity was focused entirely on weapons production. "The breach points are expanding," she reported to Admiral Thompson during their daily briefing on Haven. "What started as pinhole tears in dimensional space are now massive rifts, and something is definitely coordinating the expansion from the other side. Thompson studied the holographic displays showing the barrier's degradation across 17 sectors. How long before complete failure? At current rate of expansion, 6 months for total barrier collapse. But the entities on the other side aren't waiting for complete failure. They're pushing through wherever the barriers are weakest, and each breakthrough gives them more understanding of our dimensional structure. And the Confederation still isn't responding to our warnings? Chen's expression darkened. They've classified all information about the attacks. Their public position is that isolated terrorist incidents have occurred in remote systems, and their security forces are handling the situation appropriately. Terrorist incidents, Thompson repeated with bitter humor. Reality-warping entities from outside our dimension, and they're calling it terrorism. Fear makes people stupid, Chen observed. They're so afraid of looking weak that they're pretending the threat doesn't exist. Meanwhile, 3 more colonies have gone dark, and refugee reports suggest that whatever these entities are doing to captured populations is worse than death. Thompson activated a different display showing the deployment of human forces across their new territories. Every ship was armed to the teeth. Every colony defended by orbital weapons platforms that could glass entire continents. It was exactly the kind of militarization that had made the Confederation nervous about humanity in the first place. Status report on Project Prometheus? Dr. Yukawa believes she can adapt our fusion torpedoes to disrupt dimensional stability, Chen replied. The theory is that if we can create localized space-time distortions, we might be able to seal smaller breaches or at least slow the entity's advance through dimensional barriers. And the risks? Potentially destabilizing local star systems, Chen admitted. The energy release could trigger solar flares or gravitational anomalies that would sterilize entire planets. But given what we're facing, it might be our only option. Before Thompson could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the command center. Emergency lights bathed the room in red as his communications officer called out urgent reports. Admiral, we're receiving distress signals from the Kepler colony in Sector 7. They report massive dimensional breach and request immediate assistance. Signal is fragmenting, but they're saying something about the entities attempting direct communication. Communication? Thompson leaned forward. Patch it through. Maximum filters to prevent psychic contamination. The main screen filled with static before resolving into a chaotic image from Kepler colony's command center. Human officers worked frantically at damaged consoles while reality seemed to warp and bend around them. The walls rippled like water, and shadows moved independently of the objects that cast them. Through the distortion, a familiar voice called out, "This is Governor Martinez at Kepler Colony. The breach opened 6 hours ago, and they've been trying to establish contact ever since. We think they want to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" Thompson demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Surrender," Martinez replied grimly. "They're offering to spare selected human populations in exchange for cooperation. They say they recognize us from their memories of the ancient war, and they want to understand how we survived when our creators did not." The implications hit Thompson like a physical blow. The entities knew about humanity's connection to the barrier builders. Whatever species had created both the barriers and the genetic sequences in human DNA, these beings had fought them before. "Tell them we're not interested in surrender," Thompson ordered. "Full evacuation of Kepler Colony, all non-essential personnel to evacuation transports immediately. Military personnel are to hold the line until evacuation is complete." "Sir," Martinez's voice was strained. "They're not just communicating through technology. They're inside our heads, showing us visions of what they call the last harvest. Humans fighting alongside beings of pure energy, entire fleets being consumed by something that turns matter into consciousness. They're claiming we're the descendants of their ancient enemies." "Then we know whose side we're on," Thompson declared. "Hold the line, Governor. Help is coming." As Thompson's fleet raced toward Kepler Colony, emergency transmissions flooded in from across human space. The entities weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They were specifically targeting human settlements, and their attacks showed clear signs of tactical intelligence. Probe forces tested defenses, main assaults followed predictable military patterns, and they seemed to anticipate human responses with disturbing accuracy. The battle for Kepler Colony lasted 18 hours and cost humanity its first starship to the entity's weapons. The destroyer UES Valiant attempted to ram a massive breach point that was disgorging creatures made of crystallized space-time and simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or vaporized, but edited out of reality as if it had never been built. But humanity's response showed why the Confederation had been afraid of their violent nature. When conventional weapons failed, they improvised. Fusion reactors were overloaded and used as makeshift bombs. Civilian ships were loaded with experimental dimensional disruptors and turned into suicide weapons. Even the colony's agricultural equipment was weaponized, with farming drones modified to deliver chemical payloads that disrupted the entity's dimensional coherence. By the time the evacuation was complete, Kepler Colony was uninhabitable, but the breach point had been sealed. More importantly, humanity had proven that these beings could be fought and even defeated with sufficient determination and firepower. News of the victory spread quickly through human space, but it also reached the Confederation through refugee reports and intercepted communications. For the first time since the exile, Confederation leaders found themselves considering the possibility that they might need humanity's help. Ambassador Vextar received authorization to establish covert contact with human leadership, though officially the Confederation maintained its position that humanity remained expelled and unwelcome in civilized space. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on him as he composed a carefully worded message requesting a meeting to discuss matters of mutual concern. Admiral Thompson's response was equally diplomatic and far more pointed. Humanity remembers its warnings being dismissed as warmongering paranoia. We remember being cast out for the crime of recognizing threats that peaceful civilizations could not acknowledge. If the Confederation wishes to discuss mutual concerns, they may send representatives to Haven Colony with full diplomatic immunity. We will listen to what you have to say, though we make no promises about what we will choose to do with the information. The meeting was scheduled for 1 week later, but events in the galaxy were accelerating beyond anyone's control. 2 more Confederation worlds fell to dimensional incursions, and the barrier monitoring stations reported massive energy buildups, suggesting that the entities were preparing something far larger than their previous attacks. Dr. Chen's analysis of the latest breach incidents painted a terrifying picture. "They're not random attacks anymore," she explained to the assembled human military leadership. "The pattern suggests they're systematically mapping our reality's fundamental structure. Each breach gives them more data about how our dimension operates, and they're using that information to plan larger incursions." "How much larger?" asked General Morrison, the grizzled veteran who commanded humanity's ground forces. "Theoretical analysis suggests they could open stable portal networks large enough to move their main forces through," Chen replied. "We're talking about invasion on a scale that would make our historical conflicts look like minor border skirmishes." "And the Confederation still thinks they can handle this through peaceful negotiation?" Morrison asked with disgust. "The Confederation is terrified," Chen corrected. "They've spent 18,000 years believing that peace and diplomacy could solve any problem. The idea that something exists that can't be reasoned with, can't be bargained with, and wants nothing more than to consume our reality is completely outside their experience." Thompson studied the tactical projections with the calm focus that had made him one of humanity's most effective military leaders. "Then we need to be ready to fight this war alone. Confederation support would be helpful, but we can't count on it." 3 days before the scheduled diplomatic meeting, the largest dimensional breach in recorded history tore open in the heart of Confederation space. The Nexus system, home to the galaxy's largest trade hub and most advanced shipyards, became a battleground between reality and something that existed beyond the normal laws of physics. The entities that poured through the breach were unlike anything previously encountered. Where earlier incursions had been conducted by beings of energy and crystallized space-time, these new entities appeared to be entire ecosystems of impossible life. Creatures made of living mathematics consumed the space station's computational networks. Parasitic concepts infected the thoughts of refugees and turned them into willing servants. And at the center of it all, something vast and ancient spoke directly into the minds of every sentient being in the system. Its message was simple. We have returned to finish the harvest that was interrupted eons ago. Surrender and become part of something greater than your limited existence. Resist and be consumed anyway, but with suffering. The Confederation Council received fragmentary reports from the Nexus system for exactly 12 hours before all communication ceased. When emergency response fleets arrived to investigate, they found a system transformed into something that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Planets orbited in impossible patterns, space itself had been folded into geometric shapes that hurt to perceive. And the star at the system's center pulsed with light that conveyed meaning directly into observers' minds. It was too much for beings who had known only peace for millennia. The Confederation formally requested immediate assistance from humanity, abandoning all pretense that they could handle the crisis through their own methods. Admiral Thompson received the plea for help while standing on the observation deck of the UES Defiance, watching his fleet conduct weapons tests above Haven Colony. The message was signed by every member of the Confederation Council, and its language was formal, desperate, and completely honest about the scope of the threat they faced together. "Humanity," he murmured to himself as he watched fusion torpedoes bloom like deadly flowers in the void. Cast out for being too dangerous, recalled because danger is the only thing standing between civilization and extinction. He authorized a response that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. "Humanity accepts your request for assistance. We will fight this threat not because we owe the Confederation anything, but because our species has never surrendered to monsters, no matter how vast and terrible they might be. Prepare for war." The combined fleet that assembled at the edge of Confederation space was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Sleek Confederation vessels with their diplomatic white and gold hulls flew alongside human warships painted in aggressive blacks and reds. The contrast was striking. Elegant curves designed for peaceful exploration beside angular weapons platforms, built for nothing but destruction. Admiral Thompson stood in the war room of the UES Defiance, surrounded by holographic displays showing the largest military formation in recorded galactic history. 2,000 human ships joined with 1,500 Confederation vessels, creating a force that represented the combined military might of 47 species. "The irony is not lost on me," Ambassador Vextar observed as he reviewed the battle plans. 6 months ago, we expelled humanity for being too militaristic. Now we beg them to save us with that same militarism. "The galaxy is full of ironies," Thompson replied without looking up from the tactical displays. "The biggest one is that the species you feared for being violent is the only one willing to die protecting species that cast us out." Dr. Sarah Chen entered the war room, carrying data tablets and looking grimmer than Thompson had ever seen her. As humanity's leading expert on the barrier entities, she had become the de facto scientific advisor for the combined fleet. "The situation at Nexus is worse than we initially believed," she announced without preamble. "The entities have converted the entire system into what I can only describe as a dimensional anchor point. They're using the mass of the planets and the energy of the star to stabilize massive portal networks." "How massive?" asked General Morrison, who was coordinating ground forces for potential boarding actions. "Large enough to bring through their main forces," Chen replied. Our deep space monitoring shows energy signatures consistent with fleets numbering in the millions. Whatever these beings are, the forces they've sent so far are just scouting parties. The assembled military leaders absorbed this information with varying degrees of shock. Confederation officers looked pale and shaken, while human commanders simply nodded grimly and began calculating logistics for fighting a war against impossible odds. "There's more," Chen continued. "Analysis of communications intercepts suggests that the entities recognize human genetic signatures. They keep referring to us as the inheritors of the builders and survivors of the last cleansing. Whatever species originally created the barriers that have protected this galaxy for millions of years, they apparently had a close connection to early human evolution." "Connected how?" Vexatar asked, though his expression suggested he dreaded the answer. "Near as we can determine, the barrier builders didn't just create the protective systems that kept these entities out of our reality," Chen explained. "They also modified the genetic structure of primitive humans to carry specific information and capabilities. We're not just descendants of the species that built the barriers. We're their backup plan." Thompson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. "Backup plan for what?" "For fighting a war they knew they would eventually lose," Chen replied. "The entities call it the last cleansing, but from the fragments we've decoded, it sounds like the barrier builders engaged in a holding action that lasted thousands of years. They built the barriers not to permanently keep the entities out, but to delay them long enough for humanity to evolve into something capable of mounting an effective resistance." "You're saying we were designed to be weapons," Morrison observed. "We were designed to be survivors," Chen corrected. "The barrier builders recognize that direct confrontation with entities that exist partially outside normal reality requires beings who can adapt, improvise, and fight without hesitation. Peaceful species like the Confederation members can't comprehend the level of violence necessary to combat existential threats. We can." The strategic briefing that followed lasted 14 hours and covered everything from dimensional warfare theory to the psychological profiles of species that had survived contact with the entities. By the end, even the most optimistic Confederation officers understood that they were facing a war of extinction. "The good news," Thompson announced as the briefing concluded, "is that humanity has been preparing for this fight for our entire evolutionary history. Every war we've fought, every weapon we've developed, every tactical doctrine we've refined has been leading to this moment. The species that expelled us for being too dangerous is about to discover exactly why dangerous species survive when peaceful ones don't." The first major battle took place at Sentinel Station, a massive research facility positioned at one of the barrier's weakest points. When the entities began their assault on the station, the combined fleet was ready for them. Captain Maria Santos commanded the UES Retribution as it led the human vanguard into combat against beings that defied every principle of physics she had learned in 20 years of military service. Her ship's sensors screamed warnings about gravitational anomalies, temporal distortions, and energy signatures that suggested her targets existed in at least 6 dimensions simultaneously. "Target the largest entity with fusion torpedoes," she ordered her weapons officer. "Maximum yield, continuous bombardment." "Ma'am," her science officer called out, "the target is phasing in and out of our reality. Conventional weapons are having minimal effect." "Then we make unconventional weapons," Santos replied grimly. She opened a channel to her engineering section. "Chief, I need you to overload the main reactor and rig it for proximity detonation. We're going to ram that thing and take it with us." "Captain," her executive officer protested, "that's suicide." "That's war," Santos corrected. "The Retribution was built to protect humanity and our allies. If dying accomplishes that mission, then dying is what we'll do." Before she could execute the ramming maneuver, Dr. Chen's voice crackled over the fleet communication network. "All ships, new tactical data. The entities are vulnerable to coherent gravitational pulses. If we can synchronize our attacks and focus them on single targets, we can disrupt their dimensional stability. The battle that followed became the template for every subsequent engagement in what historians would later call the Inheritance War. Human ships closed to point-blank range and delivered devastating firepower, while Confederation vessels provided long-range support and coordinated attacks. The combination of human aggression and alien precision proved devastatingly effective against enemies that had never faced organized resistance. When the largest entity at Sentinel Station finally collapsed into normal space-time, its death scream echoed across 17 star systems and caused temporary madness in anyone who heard it without proper mental shielding. But it died, proving that these beings could be killed by creatures determined enough to pay the price. The victory at Sentinel Station was followed by 3 months of running battles across the contested regions near the barrier. Human forces developed increasingly creative ways to kill beings that operated according to alien physics, while Confederation vessels learned to support tactics that horrified their peaceful sensibilities. The turning point came when Dr. Chen made a breakthrough in understanding the entity's dimensional technology. Working with salvaged components from destroyed enemy forces, she discovered that the beings weren't just invading from another dimension, they were actively consuming the structure of reality itself. "They're not conquering our universe," she explained during an emergency briefing. "They're digesting it. Every system they capture becomes part of their own dimensional space, and they use the converted matter and energy to expand their invasion capabilities exponentially." "How do we stop something that turns our own reality against us?" asked Admiral Thompson. "We turn their own weapons against them," Chen replied with a smile that would have terrified their enemies if they were capable of fear. "The barrier builders embedded control codes in human DNA for exactly this purpose. We're not just inheritors of their defensive systems. We're the activation keys for their ultimate weapon." The discovery that followed changed everything. Hidden throughout human genetic code were sequences that resonated with barrier technology at specific frequencies. When activated by extreme stress or focused determination, these sequences could interface directly with the ancient defensive networks. The first human to successfully activate their genetic inheritance was Lieutenant Commander David Park, who was dying from dimensional contamination after his ship was partially converted by entity weapons. As his consciousness began to fade, something in his DNA responded to the threat and connected him directly to the barrier network that surrounded the galaxy. For 47 seconds, Park existed as both human and living energy. His consciousness expanded across light years of space as he accessed defensive systems that had been dormant for millions of years. When he died, the barrier sector around his location strengthened dramatically, sealing 3 major breach points and severing the entity's connection to their invasion fleet. Dr. Chen's analysis of Park's neural patterns during the activation event provided the data needed to trigger genetic inheritance deliberately rather than accidentally. Within weeks, volunteer human crews were learning to interface directly with barrier technology, turning themselves into living weapons systems capable of fighting beings that existed beyond normal physical limitations. The final battle of the Inheritance War took place in the Nexus system, where the entities had converted an entire star system into their primary staging area. The combined fleet that entered the system was supported by 200 humans who had successfully activated their genetic inheritance, creating a force that could fight the entities on their own dimensional terms. Admiral Thompson led the assault personally. His consciousness expanded through both his flagship and the barrier networks that surrounded the battlefield. Through genetic inheritance, he could perceive the entities as they truly were. Not individual creatures, but fragments of a vast predatory intelligence that consumed realities the way sharks consumed schools of fish. "All human inheritance users," he transmitted through the barrier networks, "we end this here, whatever the cost." The battle lasted 36 hours and cost the combined fleet nearly half its ships. But when it ended, the entity's primary invasion force had been destroyed, their dimensional anchor points collapsed, and their connection to the galaxy severed. The few surviving entity forces found themselves trapped in normal space-time, where conventional weapons could destroy them easily. In the aftermath of victory, the galaxy faced a new reality. The Confederation had been saved by the species they had expelled for being too dangerous, and humanity's genetic inheritance made them the galaxy's natural protectors against extra-dimensional threats. The political reorganization took 6 months and resulted in what historians called the Haven Accords. Humanity was not only readmitted to the Confederation, but granted special status as the Dimensional Defense Force. Human fleets would patrol the barrier regions, human scientists would study dimensional threats, and human inheritance users would maintain the ancient defensive networks. Ambassador Sarah Chen, now elevated to the position of human representative to the Galactic Council, addressed the assembled delegates on the anniversary of humanity's exile. Her words would be remembered for centuries. "A year ago, you cast us out because you feared our capacity for violence. You were right to fear it, but wrong about who that violence threatened. We are not violent because we enjoy destruction. We are violent because we understand that some things must be destroyed to protect what we love." She gestured to the holographic displays showing human ships patrolling the barrier regions, their crews ready to die protecting species that had rejected them. "The entities called us inheritors of the builders, and they were correct. But we have inherited more than just genetic codes and ancient weapons. We have inherited the responsibility to stand between civilization and the forces that would devour it. You cast humanity out because you thought we were dangerous," she continued, her voice carrying across the chamber with quiet authority. "You called us back because you discovered that the universe is far more dangerous than you imagined. The reckoning you feared from our violence has come, but not for you. It has come for the enemies of life itself, and they have learned that some species refuse to surrender, no matter how hopeless the odds." The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of humanity's new role. They had gained the most effective protectors the galaxy had ever known, but those protectors were the same species they had feared and rejected. The irony was profound and unavoidable. Outside the council chambers, human patrol ships continued their eternal watch on the barrier regions. In the depths of space, inheritance users maintained vigilant contact with ancient defensive networks. And on 100 human worlds, children learned the history of their species, how they had been cast out for being too dangerous, how they had responded with warnings and preparation instead of revenge, and how they had returned to save the civilization that had rejected them. The entities beyond the barriers still existed, pressing against the boundaries of reality and searching for new ways to break through. But they faced a guardian species that had been forged by evolution and modified by ancient engineers to be the ultimate predators. Humanity had accepted the burden of eternal vigilance, and they would carry it gladly. After all, someone had to stand watch in the darkness. Someone had to be dangerous enough to fight the monsters that lurked beyond the edges of reality. And if the price of that protection was being feared by those they defended, humanity was willing to pay it. The galaxy was safe, protected by the species it had cast out for being too violent. The reckoning had come, and justice had been served, not through revenge, but through salvation. Humanity had proven that sometimes the most dangerous species is the one that refuses to let evil triumph no matter the cost. In the end, the Confederation learned that casting out their protectors had been the greatest mistake in galactic history. But they also learned that humanity's nature included not just the capacity for violence, but the wisdom to use that violence in defense of others. The species they had feared for their aggression became the guardians of peace itself, and in the vast darkness beyond the barriers, ancient enemies learned to fear the inheritors of the builders, the species that had turned their own weapons against them and proven that some civilizations are worth any sacrifice to protect. The reckoning had come, and humanity had delivered it with the precision of evolved predators and the dedication of chosen guardians. The galaxy was safe, and humanity stood eternal watch to keep it that way.